The howling winter winds of Wyoming Territory in 1878 rattled the flimsy walls of Dahlia Shaw's one-room cabin like a wolf trying to break in. But it wasn't the storm that kept her awake. It was her 3-month-old son's pitiful wailing that pierced her heart more painfully than the cold pierced her bones. She'd wrapped little Thomas in every scrap of fabric she owned, but still he cried, his tiny face red and pinched with discomfort. "Hush now, Tommy," Dahlia whispered, rocking him in her arms as she paced the dirt floor. "Mama's here." But her words provided no more warmth than the dying embers in the stone fireplace. The wood had run out hours ago, and Dahlia had nothing left to burn except the chair she sat in and the bed where her son had been born just 12 weeks prior. Her husband James had promised to return with supplies before the first snow, but that was before he'd taken a bullet in a saloon brawl 2 towns over. The news had reached her a month ago, leaving her alone with a newborn and dwindling resources. Thomas's cries grew more insistent, his little body shivering despite the layers. Dahlia fought back tears of her own. She was 22 years old, widowed, and facing the brutal Wyoming winter with nothing but determination and a mother's love. But love couldn't keep a baby warm when the temperature dropped below freezing. "Just hold on till morning," she pleaded, knowing she would have to venture out at first light to collect whatever kindling she could find in the snow-covered landscape. It might not be enough, but she had no choice. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the wind's moaning. Dahlia froze, clutching Thomas tighter to her chest. Visitors at this hour and in this weather meant trouble. Raiders, thieves, or worse, often preyed on isolated homesteads, especially those without a man's protection. She laid Thomas in his cradle and reached for James's old shotgun, checking that it was loaded before positioning herself by the door. The hoofbeats slowed and then stopped outside her cabin. "Hello, the house," a man's voice called, deep and clear against the storm's fury. "Anyone alive in there?" Dahlia remained silent, the gun steady in her hands. "I don't mean no harm," the voice continued. "Saw your chimney smoke died out. Nobody should be without fire on a night like this." Thomas's cries grew louder, betraying their presence. "I hear a baby," the voice said, closer to the door now. "Madam, if you're in there, I've got firewood and blankets. Just trying to help." Dahlia hesitated, weighing her options. Thomas needed warmth, but strangers couldn't be trusted. Still, if the man meant harm, he wouldn't have announced himself. "I've got a loaded shotgun," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "State your business clearly." "Name's Ryder Garrison, madam. I'm passing through to Fort Laramie. Spotted your cabin and got concerned when I didn't see smoke. I'm just offering assistance, nothing more." Dahlia took a deep breath and cracked open the door, keeping the shotgun visible. The blast of cold air made Thomas wail even louder. Standing on her porch was a tall figure in a heavy coat, his hat pulled low against the wind. Behind him stood a sturdy chestnut horse laden with bundles of firewood. "Your baby sounds mighty cold," the man observed, his face shadowed but his voice gentle. "I've got wood to spare and some extra blankets. He'll sleep warm tonight if you'll allow my help." Dahlia studied him in the dim light of her oil lamp. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the open sky. His eyes, though, were kind, lacking the hardness she'd come to expect from men who roamed these territories. "I don't take charity," she said firmly, even as Thomas's cries underscored her desperate situation. Ryder nodded respectfully. "Not offering charity, madam, just being a decent human." This weather don't care if you're too proud to accept help, it'll kill you and that baby just the same. His bluntness startled a short laugh from her. You've got a way with words, Mr. Garrison. Just honest ones, madam. Now, may I bring in this wood before my fingers freeze to it? Dahlia hesitated one moment longer before stepping aside. Come in then, but I'll be watching you. Wouldn't expect anything less, Ryder replied, tipping his hat before returning to his horse. Within minutes, Ryder had stacked an armful of logs by her fireplace and set about building a proper fire. His movements were efficient, practiced, revealing a man accustomed to wilderness survival. Dahlia watched him warily, still holding Thomas, who continued to fuss. As flames began to lick at the fresh wood, Ryder turned to her. Fire'll be roaring soon. May I? He gestured to his saddlebags, which he'd brought inside. When Dahlia nodded, he withdrew a thick woolen blanket. Army issue, not pretty, but warmer than anything you can buy in these parts. Thank you, Dahlia said quietly, accepting the blanket and wrapping it around Thomas. The baby's cries began to soften as the cabin slowly warmed. You're alone out here? Ryder asked, his tone careful, non-judgmental. My husband died last month, Dahlia answered, seeing no point in lies. We were hoping to build something here. Now it's just me and Thomas. Ryder's expression remained neutral, but something flashed in his eyes, sympathy perhaps, or recognition of a familiar pain. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Shaw, Dahlia Shaw. Mrs. Shaw, he nodded respectfully. You've got grit staying out here alone with a little one. Didn't have much choice, she replied, sitting in her single chair as Thomas finally began to settle. Winter came early and I couldn't make it to town before the snow. Ryder studied the cabin's sparse furnishings and the nearly empty shelves where food should have been stored. Without comment, he returned to his horse and brought in a small burlap sack. Got some jerky, coffee, and hardtack, he said, placing it on her small table. Not much, but it'll help. Mr. Garrison, I can't. You can and you will, he interrupted firmly. For the boy's sake. You can pay me back come spring if your pride demands it. Dahlia felt a flush of both embarrassment and gratitude warm her cheeks. You're very kind to strangers, Mr. Garrison. Not always, he admitted with a slight smile. But I've been cold and hungry before. No one should face that alone, especially not with a child. The fire was blazing now, filling the cabin with blessed warmth. Thomas had finally fallen asleep in Dahlia's arms, his tiny face peaceful for the first time in hours. He'll sleep warm tonight, Ryder said softly, echoing his earlier promise. I should be on my way. Dahlia looked up sharply. In this storm, you'll freeze before you make 10 miles. Ryder shrugged. I've weathered worse. Don't be foolish, she said, surprising herself with her vehemence. There's room enough on the floor by the fire. It would be poor thanks to send you back into that cold after your kindness. Ryder seemed to weigh her offer, glancing from the now cozy fire to the howling darkness outside. If you're certain, Mrs. Shaw, I'd be grateful for the shelter. I am, and please call me Dahlia. Dahlia, he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. Then I'm Ryder to you. As Ryder settled his bedroll near the fireplace, Dahlia placed Thomas in his cradle, now positioned closer to the warmth. For the first time in weeks, she felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. Tonight, at least, they would not freeze. Morning brought clear skies and sunlight that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a glittering wonderland. Dahlia awoke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in her cabin and tensed before remembering her visitor. Ryder was already up, adding wood to the fire and preparing coffee in her old pot. He'd moved quietly, respectful of her and Thomas's sleep. "Good morning," he said, noticing her stirring. "Hope I didn't wake you." "No," Dahlia assured him, sitting up and adjusting her shawl. Thomas still slept peacefully, his breathing even and relaxed. "I'm usually up earlier, actually. I think we both needed the rest." "Coffee's almost ready," Ryder offered, "and I spotted some rabbit tracks just outside. Thought I might try my luck if you don't mind me staying a bit longer." Dahlia hesitated. Old warnings about strange men warring with practical necessity. But Ryder had proven himself trustworthy, and fresh meat would be a blessing. "I'd appreciate that. I've got some dried beans I can add to make a stew." Ryder nodded and handed her a steaming cup of coffee. Careful not to let their fingers touch a small gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed. "Your boy there," he said, nodding toward Thomas. "He's strong. You can see it in how he holds his head." Dahlia smiled, the first genuine smile in weeks. "Yes, he is. Takes after his father that way." "If you don't mind my asking, what brought you folks out here? This is harsh country for homesteading, especially so far from town." Dahlia sipped her coffee, savoring its warmth. "It was cheaper land. James had dreams of raising horses once we got established. He grew up on a horse farm in Kentucky before the war changed everything." Ryder nodded thoughtfully. "Good horse country, this area. Good water and grass come spring." "That's what James said." Dahlia glanced around the small cabin. "Not that it matters now. We'll likely move to town once winter breaks." "Giving up the claim?" "What choice do I have?" Dahlia asked, a familiar hopelessness creeping into her voice. "I can't work this land alone, not with Thomas to care for." Ryder didn't immediately respond, his expression thoughtful as he finished his coffee. "Let me get that rabbit," he said finally, reaching for his coat. "We'll talk more over breakfast." He returned less than an hour later with 2 plump rabbits, already skinned and cleaned. Dahlia had Thomas up and fed by then, and the baby lay contentedly on a blanket near the fire, fascinated by the dancing flames. As they worked together preparing the meal, Ryder deftly cutting the meat while Dahlia added her precious beans and the last of her salt, a comfortable rhythm developed between them. Dahlia found herself sharing more about her journey west with James, their dreams for the homestead, and her fears for the future. Ryder listened attentively, offering occasional comments, but mostly giving her the rare gift of being truly heard. In turn, he shared bits of his own story, years spent as a scout for the Army, followed by work driving cattle and occasionally guiding settlers. He avoided mention of the war, though Dahlia guessed from his age that he'd likely seen action as a very young man. "This is mighty good stew," Ryder complimented as they ate. "Best I've had in months." "Hardly," Dahlia laughed, "but thank you for the rabbits. It's been a while since we had fresh meat." Ryder set his bowl aside and leaned forward, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about your situation, Dahlia. I'm not due at Fort Laramie for another 2 weeks. If you're willing, I could stay a few days, help you get better prepared for the winter." Dahlia stared at him surprised. "Why would you do that?" "Because you need help, and I'm in a position to give it," he answered simply. "I know where game runs in these parts. Could stock you up with meat to last until spring. Maybe fix that loose section of roof I noticed, too." "I can't pay you," she said cautiously. "Not asking for payment." "Then what are you asking for?" Ryder met her gaze directly. "Nothing. Just offering help to a woman and child who need it." Dahlia studied him, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. Finding none, she asked the question that had been troubling her. "Why does our fate matter to you, Mr. Garrison?" Ryder was quiet for a long moment. "Had a sister once," he finally said, his voice softer. "She married young, followed her husband west. When he died of fever, no one stopped to help her or her little girl. He looked away, his jaw tightening. By the time word reached me, it was too late." The weight of his words settled in the small cabin. Dahlia understood then that her circumstances had awakened painful memories for this man. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said gently. Ryder nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. "So, will you accept my help? Just for a few days, to get you through the worst of winter." Dahlia glanced at Thomas, thinking of the long, cold months ahead. Pride had its place, but not at the expense of her son's well-being. "Yes," she decided. "Thank you, Ryder." Those few days stretched into a week, and then 2. Ryder proved himself invaluable, bringing in more game than Dahlia could have hoped for, and teaching her better techniques for preserving the meat. He repaired the roof, reinforced the doors and windows against the cold, and built a proper woodshed that he filled with enough split logs to last well into spring. Together, they established a daily routine. Mornings were spent on essential tasks, caring for Thomas, maintaining the fire, preparing food. Afternoons, when the sun provided some warmth, Ryder worked outside while Dahlia smoked meat or mended clothing. Evenings were for hot meals and conversation by the fire, with Thomas contentedly cooing between them. Dahlia found herself looking forward to those evening talks. Ryder was well read for a frontier man, with thoughtful opinions on everything from politics to literature. He carried a battered copy of Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in his pack, and sometimes read aloud while Dahlia sewed by firelight. For his part, Ryder seemed equally drawn to their conversations. He listened to Dahlia's stories of growing up in St. Louis, her training as a teacher, and her whirlwind romance with James during his business trip east. If he thought she'd been foolish to abandon a secure position for the uncertain promises of frontier life, he never said so. On his 10th day at the cabin, Ryder returned from checking his traps with a different sort of catch, a small pine tree. "What's this?" Dahlia asked, laughing as he maneuvered the tree through the door. "Christmas is coming," he explained, setting it up in the corner. Thought the little fella might enjoy the colors. Dahlia's breath caught. In her struggle to survive, she'd lost track of the approaching holiday. "It's beautiful, but I have nothing to decorate it with." "Don't need fancy store-bought trinkets," Ryder replied, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small carving knife. "Got 2 good hands and plenty of wood scraps." That evening, they sat by the fire, whittling simple ornaments, stars, little horses, and even a crude but recognizable rabbit that made Dahlia laugh. She contributed by cutting shapes from scraps of red fabric left from Thomas's baby blanket, tying them with thread to hang from the branches. "James and I talked about Thomas's first Christmas," she said softly as they worked. "He wanted it to be special, even out here." Ryder's hand stilled on the piece of wood he was shaping. "You miss him still?" It wasn't a question, but Dahlia answered anyway. "I do, but differently now. The sharp pain has faded. Mostly I miss having someone to share the burden with." She looked up at Ryder. "Until you came." Something shifted in his gaze, a warmth, a possibility before he carefully shuttered it. "Happy to help," he said, returning to his carving. Dahlia recognized his withdrawal and respected it. Whatever was growing between them, it was too soon, too complicated. For now, it was enough that Thomas slept warm every night and that she no longer faced the winter alone. The following day brought a break in the cold, with temperatures rising enough to melt the top layer of snow. Ryder suggested they take advantage of the fair weather to hunt further afield, where he'd spotted elk tracks. "It's a full day's ride," he explained. "I could go alone, but having help with a large animal would make it easier." Dahlia hesitated, reluctant to leave Thomas. "I've never left him before." "We could bring him," Ryder suggested. "I've rigged a cradle board like the Shoshone use. He'd be secure on your back, and we'll keep him bundled warm." The thoughtfulness of his preparation touched Dahlia. "You planned this." Ryder shrugged, almost embarrassed. "Thought you both might benefit from seeing beyond these four walls. But it's your decision." The chance to breathe fresh air and see more than the immediate surroundings of her cabin was tempting. And if Thomas could safely accompany them. "Let me see this cradle board." The contraption Ryder had fashioned was sturdy and well padded, with a small hood to protect Thomas from sun and wind. He demonstrated how it would strap securely to Dahlia's back, leaving her hands free. "It's ingenious," she admitted, impressed. "Learned from watching the native women," Ryder explained. "They travel miles with babies just so." By mid-morning, they were mounted and ready, Dahlia on James's old mare, with Thomas securely fastened to her back and Ryder on his chestnut gelding. The day was bright, the air crisp but not biting, and the snow-covered landscape stretched before them like an untouched canvas. As they rode, Ryder pointed out animal tracks, useful plants that would emerge in spring, and landmarks that would help Dahlia navigate the area. His knowledge of the land was extensive, and he shared it freely, without condescension. "You should write a guidebook," Dahlia suggested after a particularly detailed explanation of how to judge distance using mountain peaks. "So much knowledge shouldn't be lost." Ryder looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Never considered it. Don't fancy myself a writer." "Yet you read Twain and can quote Shakespeare," Dahlia observed. "There's more to you than meets the eye, Ryder Garrison." A smile quirked the corner of his mouth. "Could say the same about you, Dahlia Shaw. Not many women would survive what you have." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the cold air between them seemed to warm. Thomas chose that moment to babble loudly, breaking the spell and drawing laughs from them both. "He approves of the adventure," Ryder said, reaching over to adjust Thomas's blanket. The easy gesture, so paternal and protective, caused a flutter in Dahlia's chest that had nothing to do with the cold. She urged her horse forward, suddenly needing space to collect her thoughts. They reached the hunting grounds by early afternoon. Ryder had been right. A small herd of elk grazed in a sheltered valley, unaware of the humans observing from the ridge above. "Stay with the horses," Ryder instructed, dismounting. "I'll work my way down through those trees. With luck, I'll get close enough for a clean shot." Dahlia nodded, taking the reins of his horse. "Be careful." Ryder's eyes softened. "Always am." She watched as he moved silently into the trees, rifle in hand, his movements fluid and confident. He was a man in his element, and there was an undeniable grace to his skill. Thomas fussed slightly, and Dahlia dismounted. Carefully removing the cradle board and sitting with her back against a tree trunk, she freed Thomas from his confinement and held him close, letting him stretch his little limbs while keeping him warmly wrapped. "That's a good man helping us," she whispered to her son. "Not like your pa. No one could be." but a good man all the same. The distant crack of a rifle echoed across the valley, followed shortly by a second shot. Dahlia waited, knowing it would take time for Ryder to field dress the kill if he'd been successful. Nearly an hour later, he reappeared on the ridge, waving to signal his success. "Got a young bull," he called. "If you're up to it, I could use your help bringing him in." Together they worked to butcher the elk, Ryder teaching Dahlia the most efficient techniques for processing the large animal. Thomas watched from his cradleboard, propped safely nearby, seemingly fascinated by the activity. "This will feed you through spring," Ryder said with satisfaction as they loaded the meat onto the horses. "We'll smoke most of it when we get back." Dahlia nodded, her hands raw from the work but her heart lighter than it had been in months. "I don't know how to thank you properly." Ryder glanced at her, then quickly away. "No thanks needed." "But there is," she insisted. "You've given Thomas and me a chance to survive. That's no small thing." Ryder secured the last package of meat before answering. "The way I see it, you've given me something too." "What could I possibly have given you?" He looked at her then, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Purpose. Connection." He gestured toward Thomas. "A reminder of why we endure the hardships of this life." The honesty of his words touched something deep within Dahlia. "I'm glad, then, that it hasn't been only taking on my part." Ryder stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. For a breathless moment, she thought he might touch her, might bridge the careful distance they'd maintained. Instead, he nodded toward the darkening sky. "We should head back. Don't want to be caught out after sunset." The ride home was quieter, both lost in thoughts of what had been said and what hadn't. Thomas dozed contentedly in his cradleboard, lulled by the gentle motion of the horse. As the cabin came into view, silhouetted against the setting sun, Dahlia was struck by how much more like home it seemed now than when they'd left that morning. Ryder had brought not just warmth and security to her small world, but also possibility. The following days were busy with preparing the elk meat, smoking some, salting other portions, rendering fat for cooking and candle making. Ryder worked tirelessly, teaching Dahlia techniques that would serve her long after he'd gone. The thought of his departure, once a distant concern, now loomed over Dahlia like a storm cloud. His 2 weeks had stretched to nearly 3, but his duty at Fort Laramie couldn't be postponed indefinitely. "I should leave tomorrow," he said quietly one evening as they sat by the fire. Thomas was asleep in his cradle. The cabin was warm and well stocked, and the Christmas tree glowed with their handmade decorations. "The fort will be expecting me, and the weather looks favorable for travel." Though she'd been expecting it, the announcement still felt like a blow. Dahlia nodded, keeping her eyes on her mending. "Of course. You've done more than enough here." "Dahlia," Ryder said, his voice gentle, "look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, not bothering to hide her sadness. "I don't want to leave," he admitted. "These weeks here with you and Thomas, they've been the best I've known in years." "Then don't go," she said before she could stop herself. Ryder's expression was pained. "I gave my word. The fort is expecting dispatches I carry, and there are supplies waiting there that settlements further west are counting on." "I understand," Dahlia said, and she did. Ryder was a man of honor. It was part of why she'd come to care for him. "Will you come back? After your duty is done?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all they hadn't said. "Would you want me to?" Ryder asked carefully. Dahlia set aside her mending and moved to sit beside him on the bench he'd crafted. "Yes," she said simply, "I would." Ryder's hand found hers, his calloused fingers entwining with her smaller ones. "Then I'll come back. I can't say exactly when, there's no telling what they'll need at the fort, but I'll return before spring planting." "Spring planting?" Dahlia questioned. "I told you I can't work this claim alone." "Not alone, no." His eyes held hers steadily. "But I know something about horses, and I've been thinking about settling somewhere. If you'd be amenable to a partnership of sorts." Dahlia's breath caught. "What kind of partnership?" "The kind that starts with mutual respect and shared work," Ryder said carefully, "and might in time grow into something more, if you were willing." "And Thomas?" she asked, thinking of her son. Ryder's expression softened. "I've grown mighty fond of that boy. Would be proud to help raise him, teach him what I know." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Dahlia's eyes. "You hardly know us." "I know enough," Ryder said firmly. "I know you're brave and resourceful. I know Thomas has your spirit, and I know that leaving you both will be the hardest thing I've done in years." Dahlia squeezed his hand. "Then come back to us." "I will," he promised, "and next winter no baby in this cabin will cry from cold." Morning brought fresh snow and the inevitability of goodbye. Ryder packed his few belongings efficiently, leaving behind most of the supplies he'd brought, insisting Dahlia would need them more than he would. "The fort will outfit me for the return journey," he assured her when she protested, "and I'll bring more when I come back." Dahlia held Thomas as they stood at the door, watching Ryder saddle his horse. The past weeks had transformed her world, bringing not just physical comforts, but also hope for a future she'd thought lost with James's death. Ryder approached them, his pack slung over his shoulder. "I left detailed maps in that journal on the table," he said, his practical tone belied by the emotion in his eyes. "Marked the best hunting grounds and where to find early spring greens when the snow melts." "Thank you," Dahlia said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. "For everything." Ryder nodded, then gently touched Thomas's cheek. The baby grabbed his finger, holding tight in that instinctive way of infants. "Strong grip," Ryder observed with a smile. "He'll make a fine horseman someday." "We'll be waiting for you to teach him," Dahlia said. Ryder's eyes met hers, and this time he didn't hide the depth of feeling there. "May I?" he asked softly. Dahlia nodded, understanding his unspoken request. Carefully, mindful of Thomas between them, Ryder leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle, almost tentative, but filled with promise. "I'll be back before the snow melts completely," he vowed as he drew away. "That's my solemn word." "I believe you," Dahlia said, and she did. Something in these weeks together had built a foundation of trust between them that transcended their brief acquaintance. With a final nod, Ryder mounted his horse and turned toward the trail. At the edge of the clearing, he looked back, raising his hand in farewell. Dahlia lifted Thomas's little arm to wave back, her heart full of a mixture of sadness and anticipation. The future was still uncertain, but no longer bleak. Whatever came, they would face it with renewed strength and, God willing, with Ryder by their side. As his figure disappeared into the trees, Dahlia carried Thomas back into their cabin, now warm and well-provisioned. On the table lay Ryder's journal, and beside it, something she hadn't noticed before, a small wooden carving of a family, a man, a woman, and a child. Dahlia picked it up, tracing the careful details with her finger. It was a gift, yes, but also a promise, a vision of what might be when spring came to the Wyoming wilderness. "He'll be back," she whispered to Thomas, who cooed contentedly in her arms, "and next Christmas we'll be a family." Outside, the winter wind continued to blow, but inside the little cabin all was warm and filled with hope. The baby who had cried through the cold night now slept peacefully, just as the cowboy had promised, and would continue to do so through this winter and beyond.